some new potential trade targets for the Minnesota Wild. Plus, what do the Wild need to do to beat the struggling Maple Leafs tonight? We find out that and more today on Locked On Wild.
You're Locked On Wild, your daily podcast on the Minnesota Wild, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's happening, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Locked On Wild, your daily Minnesota Wild podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen every day. And just as a reminder, Locked On Wild is free and available wherever you listen to podcasts. On today's episode of Locked On Wild, we look at a couple of new names that have been linked to the Minnesota Wild in potential trade talks and a big superstar in the Central Division that is going to be available at the deadline. We'll talk about that, plus look ahead to tonight's matchup against the Toronto Maple Leafs, what the Wild's lineup is going to look like, and what the Wild need to do to take advantage of a Maple Leafs team that is struggling right now. My name is Seth Topal, host of Locked On Wild, your veteran Minnesota sports content producer with a full decade's worth of experience covering your favorite Minnesota sports teams, and now the captain of Locked On Wild. Happy to be with you here on a Thursday edition of the show. And obviously tonight, the Wild's going to take on a Toronto Maple Leafs team that they squared off against earlier in the season. We'll talk about some of the keys to that matchup. But in just kind of reading the tea leaves this week, it has been interesting to see some new names appear in the trade mill, the rumor mill that could potentially be linked to the Minnesota Wild, depending on how things go at the deadline. Now, I'll preface this by going with kind of what we have said throughout the entirety of the season is I'm just going to be flat out honest, and some of these trades I don't view as legitimate upgrades. They have still been linked, though, to the Minnesota Wild recently. But if it's going to be a trade that the Wild do, it has to make sense as a clear-cut upgrade over what they currently have. Now, what they currently have is going through a little bit of a skid, but that coincides with some players being out of the lineup. Sounds like Matt Zuccarello will hopefully be back tonight. No Jordan Greenway, though. So Zuccarello back in, Greenway out. But we'll talk about that to finish off the show here today. The first name that we'll talk about is Coyotes center Travis Boyd. There was an article written, and I will attempt to find it. Scrolling through Twitter yesterday and saw the Wild linked, but for the life of me, I cannot find the article, which great, but linked to Travis Boyd, and the article pointed out that with the Coyotes in their current predicament, it might be a situation where the Wild could send a contract back to Arizona in return, such as Victor Rask, to get some of that money off the books. Now, I know he's in Iowa, so that may not be as much of an issue as it was a few days ago, but it is interesting. You look at what Boyd has done this season. He's got 10 goals and 13 assists, 23 points in 43 games, and is averaging right around 16 minutes of time on the ice. And I'm going to just go right back to what I said before we even started looking at these. I don't know that this is a clear-cut upgrade. This would be more of a depth move for the Minnesota Wild should they choose it. Boyd is technically their top-line center with Clayton Keller and Nick Schmaltz, but I mean, I don't know. It wouldn't move the needle for me, I don't think. Are you going to put him on the top line with Kirill Kaprizov and Matt Zuccarello? I don't think that's enough of an upgrade over what you have with Ryan Hartman, even though Hartman is going through a little bit of a slide right now with his production. Is he an upgrade over Freddie Gaudreau? I mean, that second line continues to just get it done on a night in, night out basis. So while Boyd has been linked, I don't know if it's a trade that really does anything for me. If that's the route that they would decide to go. He is, of course, a Minnesota native, so there is that tie as well. But in terms of that, I don't know if that would be one that Bill Guerin would really need to pursue. It doesn't strike me as something that would really be a true upgrade for the team. Another one that was linked to the Minnesota Wild is right winger Josh Bailey. Bailey with 3 goals, 19 assists, 22 points in 40 games so far this season. And again, here, I think we're in the same mode. And with the injuries that the Wild have sustained over the last couple of weeks, maybe there is more of a need to grab a guy or two like this to just help kind of fill out the lineup. But if we're ranking kind of where things are at with the trade market, center potentially for that second line, and then depth probably after that. I don't know. This just seems like another one that I don't really get the sense that would move the needle too much. If the Wild were able to go that route, he's not much of a scorer, and I think it just makes more sense for the Wild to try to upgrade that center spot and then use like Freddie Gaudreau as depth or Nico Sturm as depth for the rest of the season, as opposed to bringing in depth and not addressing that second line center. So that again is probably a no for me. The big one that is really intriguing, and this was announced on Twitter, is that Nashville is going to explore possibilities for a Filip Forsberg trade. So that certainly is one that gets you to kind of to double take. You had my curiosity, now you have my attention from Django Unchained. So if Forsberg were to come available, that certainly would be much more along the lines of an upgrade. Now, not a center. He is a winger, but I find it very interesting that we're going to go into the offseason with the Kevin Fiala situation needing to be addressed. Maybe you just address it right away and go for the home run to bring Forsberg in and see what he can do for the rest of the season. That feels a little bit like a lateral move for me. Forsberg, 26 goals, 18 assists on the season. And he maybe is a slight upgrade or maybe a little bit of an upgrade over Kevin Fiala, but you are cutting off your nose to spite your face. So yes, you're upgrading at the Fiala spot, but then you still haven't done anything with the center position on that line. So is it something that the Wild should potentially take a look at? It would depend on what the cost would be if Fiala was not involved and what the center spot at that line would look like if Forsberg was acquired. There'd have to be a lot of juggling to put him into the lineup. But I don't know. Bill Guerin, I think I get the sense that he is going to keep this one pretty close to the vest up until the deadline. So who knows what he's thinking? We'll attempt to figure that out because he has made some comments here recently on a couple of different shows. And so we'll try to get kind of the sense of what Guerin's direction is going to be with this team as we guide further and further towards the trade deadline. More to come on today's episode of Locked On Wild after this. Football might be over for this season, but basketball is in full steam for both pro and college hoops. From all the latest odds, totals, player performance props, to where the next fired coach is going to land, BetOnline.net is the number one spot for all of your sports betting needs. BetOnline remains the best spot for all of your sports scores, podcasts, and news this season. And it's not just basketball. BetOnline.net is your source for hockey, boxing, and UFC odds. So head to their website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and the action. You can find all of that and much more at BetOnline, where the game starts. Continuing today's episode of Locked On Wild. Again, thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen every day. For your next listen, make sure to check out the Locked On Now podcast, nightly recaps of every NHL game with analysis from our local experts. The Locked On Now podcast is free and available wherever you listen to your podcasts. Continuing today's episode of Locked On Wild, taking a look at some potential trade targets that have recently been linked to the Minnesota Wild. We'll pivot now to some of the comments that Bill Guerin has made over the course of the last couple of days in setting us up for what to expect as we move towards the trade deadline, which is March 21st. So coming right up now, officially under a month away from the NHL trade deadline. So Bill Guerin was on with Dan Barrero of KFAN yesterday, and Guerin keeping things pretty measured, pretty calculated, as you would expect. That's not a spot that you're really going to break any news or do anything to really tip your hand. He did mention that the team, as currently constructed, when they're on their game, when they're playing their best, is one that's really hard to beat, and they just are a little off with the players out of the lineup. Obviously, as we've seen, the Matt Dumba injury has really hurt this team defensively. Of course, no Matt Zuccarello against Ottawa, which hurt. But, at the end of the day, Guerin said that he is going to do what he needs to do in order to keep this team competitive. And if there's an opportunity to upgrade, he's going to take it. I thought it was most interesting during his comments in which talking about Fiala's future with the team seemed to hesitate a little bit, said that we are not committed. We are not looking to trade Fiala right now. And I don't know if that was intended to be like that or if that was just kind of a little bit of an accidental pause. But it is interesting with all this talk, and I know we here at Locked On Wild have certainly flipped our opinion to the keep Fiala category. There are a lot of tough decisions for this team coming up as we get closer to the offseason with who to keep and how to navigate through what's going to be a very tight salary cap situation. We have seen a little bit to kind of counter those salary cap concerns, the John Merrill extension, the Jordan Greenway extension. And so, it does seem like this Wild team is being very deliberate with the guys that they want to keep on this roster, as opposed to the guys who are probably going to just be walking when the season is up. Now, the biggest one here recently has, of course, been Nico Sturm, who was going to be healthy scratched for 2 games in a row before the injury to Matt Zuccarello. You look at the names that are on the list at the end of this season. You've got Kevin Fiala, of course, who is a restricted free agent. Matt Boldy will be a restricted free agent in 2023. So that is a contract situation that's going to need to be addressed at some point. You got Victor Rask coming off the books. Nick Bugstad coming off the books, Nico Sturm all coming off the books. Rask, I don't think at this point with him being sent down to Iowa, not sure if he's reported yet. The team, from the sounds of it, wanted to give him a little time to obviously a frustrating situation for him. And getting sent down to Iowa obviously wanted to give him a little time to kind of get his mind right before he reported to the Iowa Wild. But I don't think he will be a player that returns, and so his salary comes off the books. Nick Bugstad, now with him again showing some nice life after returning from injury. Maybe that's another situation where you look to try to sign him back as a depth or fourth liner. That could certainly be a possibility. But then you've got, on defense, you've got Goligoski, you've got Jordy Ben. Those guys will come off. And another big one is Capo Kakkonen, will be a restricted free agent this offseason. So opportunity for him to look at a long-term deal with this team. So a lot of the pieces are in place, but there are other pieces that are going to need to be addressed, and that's going to require some cap space or some very, very tricky maneuvering of it. And so it just continues. The steam continues to push towards there being some sort of a trade to free up some additional cap space. And as Kevin Fiala continues to put up this just great season, now on par, if he continues it, to have a career year in a year in which he could definitely cash in. Hopefully he has not priced himself out of the Wild's range, but at the end of the day, there's going to be a number that the Wild can hit, and if Fiala plays better than that, then it's probably going to head towards a trade at that point to see what they can get in return. It'd be unfortunate, but sometimes that's just how the business works, and that was certainly the direction the Wild went, going to a one-year deal for this year. That's not going to fly a second time. So it'll be fascinating to see, but main thing to kind of pull away is that it seems as though Guerin wants to kind of stick with what has got the team here, and rightfully so, because when everybody was healthy, this team was one of the best in the NHL, able to beat anybody on any given night. They've had to handle some adversity here recently, but those pieces all still can put this team back to where it needs to be. And so the question now is, if you add to that, what do you get? So it'll be very interesting to see how this is played out over the next couple of weeks in leading up to that March 21st trade deadline. We do have a game to discuss for tonight. So to finish off today's episode, we will preview what's going on in tonight's game. We'll look at some of the lineup juggling that's going to go on for the Wild here tonight. And so we'll set our sights on the Toronto Maple Leafs to close out today's show next here on Locked On Wild. Final segment of today's episode of Locked On Wild. Again, thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen every day. Toronto Maple Leafs are in the midst of a little bit of a skid as well. They are 2-4-1 in their last 7 games. They have lost 3 in a row, including a 4-3 overtime loss most recently to the Columbus Blue Jackets. But before that, a 6-3 loss to the St. Louis Blues, a 5-2 loss to the suddenly hot Montreal Canadiens. And if you pull back even a little bit further, 3-2 loss to Vancouver and a 5-2 loss to Calgary in that stretch. They beat Seattle 6-2 and Pittsburgh 4-1. For most of this run, it has been Jack Campbell in net, and his performance has been very uneven here in the month of February. A goals against average just above 3, and he has had, in the month of February, 3 starts where he's given up at least 4 goals. The defense for the Maple Leafs has been a little bit of a struggle point as well. And so for the Wilds, this presents an opportunity to pick up a win here, get themselves back on track. But it looks like it's going to require somebody to step up with the team shorthanded once again. According to reports from earlier today, it looks as though Matt Zuccarello is going to make his return to the lineup. So the hope is that he'll be able to slot in on that that top line. No harm, no foul there. But Mason Shaw is ready if needed to step up and play. And so Greenway's injury, according to Michael Russo, a little more serious than was initially thought. Greenway will stay with the team on the trip and go to Calgary to finish things off. Nick Bjugstad is going to slot in to his spot on that third line. So you've got, assuming that Zuccarello is able to play, you'll have Kaprizov, Hartman, Zuccarello as normal. We will also, regardless, have Fiala, Goudreau, and Boldy as normal. We'll get Joel Eriksson Ek, Marcus Foligno, and Nick Bjugstad on that line. I would imagine if Zuccarello is not able to play, that line will stay as is. Or actually, I take that back. So let's assume if Matt Zuccarello is not able to play, what is probably going to happen is this. Brandon Duhaime will probably be elevated to that third line. Nick Bjugstad elevated to the top line. And Mason Shaw then slots in on the fourth line with Nico Sturm and Connor Dewar. That's probably how it will work out, even though I had just advocated for the team to try to mix these lines up as little as possible. Bjugstad playing well since his return, and I think he can be a little bit more of a puck mover than having Foligno be on the top line again. I'd rather not see that attempted ever again. Second line obviously is just going to stay intact. They're the hottest line on the team right now, and there's no reason for any sort of shakeup with those guys. While they're going to need to lean on them again in this game, just like they did in the Senators game. That third line, I think if you put Dewar there, you get pretty similar to what you would normally get from that line with the physicality and the defensive presence. The fourth line, I think, is going to be the wild card, because if Shaw does play, how much does that pull away from the chemistry that Connor Dewar and Brandon Duhaime have? So let's just assume that Zuccarello is going to play and that he is able to slot in on that top line. Then I think everything looks a little closer to normal, and that can allow the Wild to deploy those two scoring lines to take advantage of this Maple Leafs defense that has been pretty bad over the last few games. Now, obviously, with the Maple Leafs, you have to watch out for Austin Matthews. They also have a couple of guys getting close to the 20-goal plateau. Mitch Marner, John Tavares, William Nylander also at 19 goals. But my main point here is that this is a very winnable game, and this is a Wild team that needs one here tonight to stop this skid and to kind of give themselves a little bit of a boost heading into a home with the Calgary Flames, who are in the midst of one of the hottest stretches of hockey that we've seen so far this season. So if we were to do some keys to tonight's matchup, I would love if we would see a better start to this game. That's become too big of a pattern, as we talked about. Get off to a hot flying start, even if you're not scoring. Just show that you're kind of engaged with what's going on in the game right from puck drop. Do that Capo getting the start against the Maple Leafs. I'm excited to see what he will do in net because he has been really good over his last handful of starts. Dean Evison did make the comment after the Senators game that there's really no worry about Cam Talbot in that a lot of, not all, but a lot of what is going on can be pinpointed to some things on defense. So if that's the case, then yeah, let's see that get tightened up so that he can get back to looking a little more towards the Cam Talbot we saw at the beginning of the season. So let's see a strong effort from Capo here tonight. Let's see the first and second lines really take over this game, and I would like to avoid seeing the Wild be the team that gets the Maple Leafs back on track. Seems like that has also been something that has happened quite often here over the last handful of games. Is you got a team that is just not playing well, and they go up against the Wild and they get right back on track. So just take control of this thing early and get a couple of goals right off the bat to give Capo a little bit of a breather so that we don't have to sweat it out. And let's go get like a 4-2 win and just get back on track ahead of these two Calgary games. That is going to wrap it up for today's episode of Locked on Wild. We'll, of course, recap tonight's game against the Maple Leafs for you on tomorrow's show. So make sure to tune in for that. Make sure also, now that your first listen of the day is done, to head over to the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast. Hosts Steele Roden and Flip Livingstone help you become the expert of your fantasy league. Locked On Fantasy Hockey is free and available wherever you listen to podcasts. Just like Locked On Wild, we are available anywhere you listen, anytime you want to listen. Just search Locked On Wild to find the platforms that you can listen to our show each and every day. Make sure to check us out on social media as well. A big reveal coming next week for a fun social media event that Locked On Wild is going to be putting on for the month of March. So stay tuned for that coming up on Sunday. And we will continue to keep you up to date on all things Minnesota Wild, whether it be big news or a puck drop anywhere in the state of hockey. Locked On Wild has you covered with new episodes every Monday through Friday as part of the Locked On Podcast Network.